There is a sound the universe makes when it is at peace. The Velsheri had a word for it, Sothermine, which translated loosely into something between the hum of continued existence and the breath between disasters. It was not a metaphor for them. It was literal. The Velsheri were a species that perceived the universe, primarily through resonance. They did not see color the way humans did. They did not smell or taste with any organ that would make sense to a biologist from Earth. But they felt frequency the way a pianist feels a chord, not just as sound but as meaning, as emotion, as fact. Their homeworld, Velshar Prime, sat in the outer spiral of the Kethera cluster, a dense and ancient region of space where 17 sentient civilizations had risen, collapsed, negotiated, merged, and risen again over the course of 400,000 years. The cluster was old. Its politics were older. And at the center of all of it, the invisible thread that kept the whole fragile web of alliances, resource agreements, and non-aggression treaties from collapsing into open war, was something called the Accord Frequency. Not a document. Not a treaty signed on paper.
A sound.
A continuous, low, subsonic signal broadcast from a relay station orbiting a dead star at the exact geometric center of the Kethera cluster. The station was called the North Cairn, named after the Velsheri diplomat who gave her life to build it 6,000 years ago. The signal it broadcast was not music, exactly.
It was more like a heartbeat.
A reminder. Every 7 seconds, a pulse of precisely calibrated electromagnetic resonance washed out across the cluster, touching every inhabited system, passing through every hull of every ship, and whispering in a frequency too low to hear, but too powerful to ignore. The Accord still holds. The Accord still holds. The Accord still holds. 17 civilizations had built their entire concept of peace around that pulse. When Velsheri children were afraid, their parents held them and said, "Listen for the 7 count." When soldiers on disputed border worlds grew restless, their commanders would put a hand on their shoulder and say, "The cairn still sings." When diplomats couldn't agree, when resources ran thin, when old grudges surfaced like bones through eroding earth, the signal was still there.
Still pulsing. Still saying, "Not yet."
Not today. The Accord holds. And then, 42 days ago, the North Cairn went silent. Not destroyed. Not attacked. Not politically decommissioned. It simply stopped. No explosion. No warning. No diplomatic incident that preceded it. One moment the 7-count pulse was there, as it had been for 6,000 years without interruption, and the next moment, there was nothing. Just the cold static of open space where the heartbeat of the Kethera cluster's peace had always lived. Within 6 hours, 3 border skirmishes broke out simultaneously in different parts of the cluster. Within 18 hours, 2 civilizations had recalled their ambassadors from each other's capitals. Within 3 days, the Drath Sovereignty, a militarized civilization on the far edge of the cluster that had been quietly building its fleet for decades, had moved warships to within striking distance of 2 neighboring systems. The Accord, which had held for 6,000 years, was unraveling in real time. And nobody knew how to fix the North Cairn, because the technology it ran on was ancient, older than any currently living civilization's recorded history. North herself had not invented it. She had only maintained it, and when she died, she left behind documents describing how to keep it running, documents that had been copied and recopied and translated and retranslated over 6 millennia until the original technical knowledge was buried somewhere beneath 6,000 years of interpretation, bureaucratic revision, and the linguistic drift of a dozen dead languages. The Velsheri ambassador, a tall and deeply resonant being named Sorvithuv the Long Measure, had spent 42 days watching the cluster slide toward war. And on the 42nd day, in desperation that bordered on grief, she sent a signal not inward toward the cluster's established civilizations, but outward, toward the edge of the galaxy, toward a small, loud, chaotic, and deeply strange civilization that had only been a member of the Kethera Accord for 11 years. The humans. She sent the signal because of something her colleague, Ambassador Thren of the Korathi, had once said about humans in a moment of exasperated fondness. They are the only species I have ever encountered who treat a problem they do not understand as a reason to get closer to it rather than further away. Sorvith did not fully understand what that meant, but she was out of options. So she called Earth. And Earth, for the first time in 11 years of Accord membership, went completely, utterly, and deliberately silent. Every civilization in the Kethra cluster had a theory about humans. The Velsheri, who understood the universe through resonance, described humans as a species that generates frequency without apparent intention, which was their polite way of saying that humans were loud in a way that seemed almost accidental. Human radio signals, human emotional broadcasts, human communication systems, they all leaked, constantly, into space, into diplomatic channels, into the background noise of every conversation held near a human delegate. You always knew when humans were in the building. Not because they were rude. Most of the time they were remarkably earnest and self-conscious about the etiquette of multi-species diplomacy, but because they simply radiated sound, heat, electromagnetic noise, opinion, curiosity. A human trying to be quiet was like a fire trying to be cool. You could appreciate the effort. You could not pretend it was working. So when Sorvitha's distress signal reached the human diplomatic relay station on the outer edge of Accord space, and then a full 17 hours passed with nothing coming back, the effect on the cluster was immediate and strange. The Kwarathi monitoring station near the relay logged it first. A technician named Vresi, young, four-armed, with the nervous habit of rotating her secondary wrist joints when she was confused, was the first one to notice. She had been monitoring human communications for 2 years as part of her posting, which meant she had grown deeply accustomed to the constant warm noise of human activity. Music. Arguments. Something the humans called podcasts, which seemed to be people talking about things in rooms for no clear political purpose. Mathematical exchanges. Weather observations. A remarkable quantity of messages that seemed to be humans sending each other pictures of their food. It was all there. Regular as breathing, warm as a hearth fire. And then it wasn't. Vresi stared at her readings for a full minute before calling her supervisor. "The human channels are down," she said. Her supervisor, a much older Kwarathi named Das, came over and looked at the readings himself. "Technical fault," he said. "I checked. All our relay infrastructure is functioning. The signal path is clear." Das stared at the empty frequency lines. In 20 years of monitoring Accord communications, he had never seen the human channels go quiet. Not once. Even when human diplomats were sleeping, there was something. Background system noise. Automated maintenance signals. Humans had an almost compulsive need to fill silence with data. "How long?" he asked. 17 hours and 4 minutes, Vresi said. Das was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that would later be quoted in 14 different intelligence briefings across the cluster. "That is not a technical failure. Machines do not go silent like that. That is a choice." He filed an urgent report to the Kwarathi Intelligence Directorate within the hour. By the time the report was being read in the Kwarathi capital, the Velsheri had noticed too.
And the Drath.
And the Inuri Compact. And the 3 smaller civilizations that shared a disputed region of the cluster's midarm, all of whom had standing agreements with Earth that they had quietly been counting on to buffer against Drath military pressure. What had been a regional diplomatic crisis suddenly acquired a new and terrifying dimension. Because nobody chose to go silent in a crisis unless they were planning something. Nobody except humans, perhaps, had the cultural vocabulary for deliberate silence as a form of communication. Every other civilization in the cluster used silence as a default. The absence of signal was normal, was background, was rest. But humans had spent 11 years filling every available channel with noise. They had trained the entire cluster to read their presence through their sound. And now they had turned it off. In the Drath Sovereignty's military command, a general named Kethsaros sat in a briefing and listened to his intelligence chief explain the human silence. When the briefing was over, Kethsaros said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "Move the fleet back." His second-in-command was stunned. "Sir, the strategic window." "Move the fleet back," Kethsaros said again. "I have spent 30 years learning how to read the cluster. I know what aggression looks like from every species in this region of space. I have never had to learn what human aggression looks like because humans have never been quiet long enough to be aggressive."
He paused. "They are quiet now."
"And I find that I am not interested in discovering what comes after the quiet." He was not wrong to be cautious. But he was not right about what the silence meant either. What was actually happening on Earth, what no intelligence service in the cluster had the framework to understand, was something far stranger, far more human, and in the end, far more consequential than any act of military preparation could have been. Earth had gone silent because Earth had gotten interested. Her name was Dr. Mara Osei, and she had spent 23 years of her life listening to things that no longer worked. Not metaphorically.
Literally.
Mara was an acoustic archaeologist, a field so niche that she had spent the first decade of her career explaining what it was at every dinner party she attended. The short version: she studied the sonic signatures of ancient structures, instruments, and machines to understand how they were built, how they were used, and what they were meant to do. She had spent 3 years listening to the stones of Stonehenge, trying to understand how the acoustic properties of the site changed with the seasons. She had spent 2 years in the ruins of a Bronze Age palace in Crete, reconstructing the resonance patterns of rooms that hadn't had sound in them for 3,000 years. She listened to dead things, and the dead things told her their secrets. She was not the obvious choice for this mission. The obvious choice most people had assumed would be an engineer, possibly a physicist, someone who understood signal architecture, electromagnetic relay systems, the technical vocabulary of ancient alien technology. But the human team that had gone silent, the 12 specialists currently en route to the North Cairn aboard the research vessel Patience, had been assembled not by the Department of Engineering or the Department of Physics. They had been assembled by a 31-year-old diplomatic attaché named James Okafor, who had read Ambassador Sorvitha's distress message very carefully and noticed something that everyone else had missed. The message described the North Cairn as a machine, but it was 6,000 years old, and it had been built by a diplomat, not an engineer, not a physicist, a diplomat who was also, by all historical accounts, a musician. James had read that detail and then spent 40 minutes sitting very still at his desk, thinking. And then he had called Mara. Mara was currently sitting in the Patience's small laboratory, surrounded by equipment that the ship's chief engineer, a pragmatic Irish woman named Bridget Walsh, had described as looking like a sound studio had a fight with a geology lab, and neither one won. There were resonance scanners, harmonic isolators, phase differentiation arrays, and in the corner, completely incongruously, a hand-built instrument that looked like a cross between a cello and something you might find in a jazz musician's fever dream, which Mara had built herself over 7 years, for reasons she had never fully explained to anyone. She called it the listener. It had no strings in the traditional sense. Instead, it had a series of tension filaments of varying material composition, gut, carbon fiber, a specific alloy she'd had custom-made after reading about acoustic properties in Byzantine metalwork, each tuned not to a specific note, but to a specific response frequency. When you ran a bow across the listener, it didn't make music so much as it made questions. It was built to vibrate in sympathy with whatever was around it, to feel what a space was made of. She had used it in 17 archaeological sites across 4 continents. She had never used it in space. She was looking at the preliminary data files that Sorvith had transmitted, everything the Velsheri knew about the North Cairn's construction, which was ancient and incomplete and maddeningly vague in all the places that mattered most, and she was not thinking about engineering. She was thinking about a woman named Norith, who had lived 6,000 years ago, who had been a diplomat and a musician, who had built a machine that kept peace across 17 civilizations, and who had built it to last. What did a person who thought in music build when they wanted something to last forever? Not a machine, Mara thought. Not really. A machine breaks. She built a song. The North Cairn was not beautiful. Every historical description that Sorvith had provided, every archive image, every sensor reading that had been taken of it over the past 6,000 years, none of it had prepared Mara for the visual reality of the structure. She had expected something imposing, something architectural, a monument to peace, built by a civilization that had decided its finest diplomat deserved a fine memorial. What she got was a tangle. The cairn was approximately 400 meters across at its widest point, and it looked, at first glance, like someone had taken a very large amount of metal and then changed their mind about what to do with it several thousand times. There were struts going in directions that served no obvious structural purpose. There were hollow channels running through the outer shell in patterns that looked random but clearly weren't. The spacing was too deliberate, the angles too precise. There were chambers of varying size distributed throughout the body of the structure in a layout that bore no resemblance to any standard engineering logic for a relay station. It looked, Mara thought, like the inside of an instrument. "You're smiling," said James, who was standing behind her at the observation window. "I know what it is," she said. "You've been looking at it for 4 minutes." "I know what it is," she said again, and she wasn't really talking to him anymore. She was talking to Norath. Because Mara had seen this before. Not this exact structure. Nothing in human archaeological experience came close to this scale or this context. But the principle was familiar. She had seen it in the acoustic chambers of ancient Greek theaters, where the geometry of the seating created resonance effects so precise that an actor whispering on stage could be heard clearly in the back row 100 meters away. She had seen it in the design of certain medieval cathedrals, where the proportions of the nave and transept created standing wave patterns that made the human voice sound, to listeners inside, as though it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She had seen it in the design of instruments. In the way a violin's body was hollow, not merely to be lightweight, but because the hollow space was the instrument. The geometry of the interior was as important as the strings, because the resonance of the enclosed air was what gave the sound its character, its warmth, its carry. The North Cairn was hollow in specific places for specific reasons. It was not a relay station that broadcast a signal.
It was an instrument that sang.
Or had sung. For 6,000 years. Until 42 days ago, when something had gone wrong with the geometry. Mara took a breath and said, "I need to go inside." Brigid, the chief engineer, immediately said, "The structural integrity reports suggest." "I know," Mara said. "I need to go inside anyway. There's a reason the Velsheri repair teams couldn't." "They were trying to fix a machine," Mara said. "I'm not going to fix a machine." "Then what are you going to do?" James asked. Mara was already moving toward the suit bay. "I'm going to find out where the song broke," she said. The inside of the North Cairn was the quietest place Mara had ever been. That sounds obvious. It was a non-functioning relay station in the cold vacuum of space. Of course it was quiet. But Mara had been in a lot of quiet places. She had spent 3 weeks in an anechoic chamber as part of a research project. She had worked in deep cave systems where the silence had a physical weight to it. She had floated in sensory deprivation tanks as part of an experimental study on acoustic perception. None of those silences felt like this. This silence felt like a held breath. She moved through the interior of the cairn slowly, her suit's acoustic sensors recording everything, and she tried to do what she always did in a new space: listen to the structure. Not with her ears. Her suit helmet filtered out too much for that. But with her eyes, with her spatial awareness, with the part of her mind that had spent 23 years learning to read what shapes were for. The interior was a series of interconnected chambers, each one lined with material that her sensors identified as a crystalline compound she had no name for, a deep blue-gray in color, smooth to the touch even through gloves, with a surface texture that her instruments described as exhibiting variable acoustic absorption coefficients across the sonic spectrum. In plain language, it absorbed some frequencies and reflected others. Selectively. Precisely. She moved deeper. The chambers got smaller. The channels narrowed. The geometry grew more intricate, more careful, more intentional. She was moving toward the center of the structure. She realized, toward whatever the Velsheri repair teams had been unable to access, had perhaps not even recognized as the heart of the thing. And then she found it. At the geometric center of the North Cairn, there was a room. It was small, perhaps 4 meters across, perfectly spherical, every surface covered in the same crystalline material. And in the center of the room, suspended on a frame of the same dull metal as the rest of the structure, was an object that she recognized immediately and completely, and with a shock so deep it felt like grief. It was an instrument, not a machine, not a relay emitter. Not a power source or a signal generator in any engineering sense. It was an instrument. It looked nothing like anything from Earth. It had Velsheri physiology built into its design, made for hands with more fingers than humans had. For a playing style, she could only partially intuit from the shape of the keys and resonating surfaces. But she knew what it was. She knew the design philosophy behind it. She knew why it was here, at the center of the structure, in a spherical room designed to amplify and project whatever sound it made outward through all those channels and chambers and hollow struts. North had not built a relay station. She had built a resonance instrument of planetary scale, designed to be played. And it hadn't broken down. It had simply run out of player. Mara stood very still in the spherical room, in the deep silence, and felt the weight of 6,000 years pressing in around her. Somewhere in the Velsheri's ancient records, she realized there was a 6,000-year-old gap that nobody had looked for. Not a technical gap. Not an engineering gap. A musical gap. For 6,000 years, someone had been coming here to play. And 42 days ago, the last one had died. Or stopped. Or forgotten. Or perhaps had never been told what they were actually doing, had just been taught to perform a ritual whose purpose had been lost so gradually that no one noticed until the music stopped. Mara keyed her calm.
James, she said. Yeah. Get me Sorvith.
A pause. The ambassador it's going to take time to. Get me Sorvith, Mara said again. Tell her I found Noritha's instrument. Tell her I know what happened to the cairn. She paused. And tell her I need to know who the last keeper was. And what happened to them. The last keeper's name was Velren of the Diminishing Line. She had been 140 years old when she died. Young, for a Velsheri, whose natural lifespan extended to nearly 300 years under good conditions. She had died not of illness but of dissonance, a Velsheri condition that had no direct human equivalent, something between profound grief and sensory collapse, where a being whose consciousness was so deeply organized around resonance and frequency experienced a disruption so severe that the body simply began to lose its own coherence. She had lost her mate, her bonded partner of 90 years, who had been her frequency twin, the Velsheri equivalent of a soul match, someone whose resonance signature was so harmonically aligned with hers that their combined presence produced chords that neither could make alone. When her partner died, Velren of the Diminishing Line had come apart slowly, like a song losing its melody, while the rhythm kept going. For 6 months, she had continued to come to the cairn, had continued to play, had continued to maintain the accord frequency. And then one day she had not come, and the music had stopped, and nobody had known what it meant until the silence had already lasted 42 days and 3 border skirmishes had already begun. Sorvith told Mara all of this in a voice that was low and tight with grief and guilt. We knew she was the keeper, Sorvith said. We knew the ritual was hers. But we had lost the understanding of why the ritual mattered. We thought it was ceremonial, commemorative. We thought the cairn was a machine that ran on its own, and the keeper's role was to honor Noritha's memory, not to. She paused. Her voice carried a resonance of shame that Mara could hear even through the translation filter. We did not understand what she was doing. If we had known, we would have. You would have found a way to learn it before she was gone, Mara said. Not accusatory. Just completing the sentence. Yes. A long silence. The instrument, Mara said. Is there anyone in your civilization who knows how to play it? Another long silence. Different in quality from the first. The instrument at the cairn is not. It is not a common instrument, Sorvith said carefully. It is a sothvale, a resonance instrument of the deep tradition. They are rare. The knowledge of how to play one is, she paused. Velren was the last practicing player of the deep tradition. There are others who know the theory, who have studied the history. But to play a sothvale at the level required to generate the accord frequency, she paused again. It requires decades of training. It requires a specific physiological capacity for resonance generation that is not universal even among Velsheri. And it requires, she stopped. It requires what? Mara asked. It requires the player to be in a state of what we call sothrmine. A pause. The peace frequency. The internal state of alignment. of being in accord with oneself. A very long pause. Velren could play, because she had found that state. And then she lost it when she lost her partner. And the music stopped. Mara was quiet for a moment. Sorvith, she said. The accord frequency, when I analyze it from the archive recordings, it's not a single note. It has harmonics. Multiple frequency layers. Yes. It sounds like it was designed to be played by more than one person. A very long pause. Yes, Sorvith said at last. In Northa's original documents, the earliest versions, before the 6,000 years of retranslation, she described the cairn as being played by a voice of many. But the later keepers, she stopped. The later keepers played it alone, Mara said.
Yes.
Because the knowledge of the original design was reduced over time, and what was passed on was only half the song, Mara said. Yes, Sorvith said. Half the song. Mara looked at the instrument in front of her. She thought about her own listener, aboard the Patience, built from gut and carbon fiber and Byzantine alloy to vibrate in sympathy with whatever surrounded it. She thought about resonance and frequency and the way a hollow space amplified sound. She thought about half a song. Sorvith, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, even if the answer seems. She paused, choosing her words. Even if it seems like it couldn't possibly be what I'm suggesting. Ask, Sorvith said. The Velsheri diplomatic tradition. The accord itself. North was a diplomat and a musician. When she built the cairn, when she designed the Sothvale at its heart, was she building it for Velsheri players? Only? The longest silence yet. Then, no, Sorvith said softly.
No.
North believed the accord required. She believed that true resonance between civilizations required that the instrument of peace be played by more than one civilization. She wrote, in the oldest documents, that she designed the Sothvale with two playing positions. One for the deep resonance. One for the pause. She used a word that does not translate well. Something like the upper voice. The new voice. The voice that has not yet learned to be afraid of the silence between notes. Mara closed her eyes. She thought about a woman who had lived 6,000 years ago, who had built an instrument of peace and designed it to need more than one pair of hands, who had somehow, impossibly, built it with a second position that had gone unused for 6 millennia, waiting, maybe, for a civilization that didn't yet exist, that hadn't yet found its way to this cluster of stars. I need to bring something from my ship, Mara said. She brought the listener. Getting it through the airlock was undignified. It was not designed for zero-gravity transport, and Bridget spent 40 minutes rigging a carrier frame for it while maintaining an expression that said, very clearly, that this was not what she had trained as a chief engineer to do. James helped without comment, which Mara appreciated. Once the listener was inside the cairn, once it was floating alongside her in the spherical central chamber, she stopped trying to plan and started doing what she had done in every difficult archaeological site she had ever worked in. She listened. The chamber was silent. The Sothvale sat in its frame, untouched, its playing surfaces covered in the accumulated stillness of 42 days without music. Mara circled it slowly. She ran her gloved fingers along its edges without touching the playing surfaces. She looked at it from every angle. It was built for Velsheri hands, more fingers, different joint articulation, sensory organs along the fingertips that humans didn't have. She could not play it the way it was designed to be played. That was simply a physiological fact, and she accepted it without frustration. She had worked with instruments she couldn't play before. She had reconstructed the sonic output of Bronze Age lyres using computer modeling because she couldn't play a Bronze Age lyre any more than she could play a Sothvale. But she didn't need to play the Sothvale. She needed to play with it. The second position, the one North had designed for the upper voice, was on the far side of the instrument from the main playing surface. It was smaller, more abstract in its design, less clearly defined as a playing interface. The Velsheri scholars who had studied the cairn over the centuries had noted it in their records and consistently described it as a structural element, possibly decorative, purpose unclear. It was not decorative. It was a resonance interface, a surface designed to accept vibrational input from an external instrument and modulate it into the Sothvale's acoustic system. Not a playing surface in the traditional sense. More like a bridge, a connection point between two different instruments, two different musical traditions, designed to blend them into a unified output. North, Mara thought, you were extraordinary. 6,000 years ago, this woman had sat down and designed an instrument of peace that could literally only work if two different civilizations agreed to play it together. She had built the need for cooperation into the physics of the thing. You could not produce the accord frequency alone. Not because it was too difficult, though it clearly was, but because the instrument itself was designed to require a partner. Mara positioned the listener at the second interface. She spent 3 hours experimenting,
Playing.
listening, adjusting the listener's tuning based on what the sensors told her about the Sothvale's resonant frequencies. She had no sheet music. She had a 6,000-year-old architectural schematic that was really more of a philosophy text than a technical document, and she had 23 years of listening to dead things until they told her their secrets, and she had the listener, which she had built precisely for moments like this, for the moment when a space you didn't understand needed you to speak its language before you could hear what it was saying. She played badly at first. The listener produced sounds that were wrong, not harmonically, but contextually. The Sothvale's crystalline resonance patterns rejected certain frequencies, absorbed others, transformed others into something that came out of the chamber's walls sounding almost right, but not quite. Like a translation that was grammatically correct, but emotionally flat. She adjusted, listened, adjusted again. James checked in twice. She answered in single syllables. At hour 4, she played something that the Sothvale didn't reject. It was a small thing, 3 notes that the crystalline surface accepted and amplified and sent shimmering through the chamber's geometry in a way that made the air feel, briefly, different. Warmer. More present. She stopped breathing for a moment. Then she played the 3 notes again. The Sothvale sang back. Not loudly. Not the full accord frequency. She was one person with one instrument and no Velsheri partner and a 42-day gap in the music to overcome. But the instrument, which had been silent for 6 weeks, responded. The crystalline surfaces vibrated. The chambers resonated. Somewhere in the structure around her, she heard, felt, really more than heard, a deep subsonic hum that she recognized from the archive recordings. The Cairn remembered the song. She started to cry, which was inconvenient inside a space helmet, and she didn't stop playing. Aboard the Korathi monitoring station, Vresi was the first to notice. She was on her 4th consecutive shift. Her supervisor had taken to letting her stay past her scheduled hours because she had developed what her colleagues were beginning to describe as an alarming personal investment in the status of human communications. She was there when the human channels had gone quiet. It seemed only right that she should be there when something changed. And something was changing. Not in the human channels. Not in any communication band she had been monitoring. Something was happening at the North Cairn. She almost missed it. It was subtle, a barely there fluctuation in the resonance sensors that the station maintained near the dead star, sensors that had been installed 600 years ago to monitor the Cairn's output and had registered nothing but flat silence for 42 days. It wasn't the accord frequency.
Not yet.
It was something quieter, more tentative, more. Vresi sat very still and listened to the data. The resonance pattern coming from the Cairn was irregular. It would build, then pause, then build again differently, then pause, then adjust. It didn't sound like a machine warming up. It didn't sound like a technical restart sequence. It sounded, in a way she couldn't quite articulate in her report, but tried anyway, like someone practicing. Like someone working out where to put their fingers. Like someone playing very carefully in a house where they weren't sure if they were allowed to make noise. She sent the data to her supervisor. Her supervisor sent it to the Intelligence Directorate. The Intelligence Directorate sent it to the Diplomatic Corps. The Diplomatic Corps sent it to every ambassador in the cluster with a note that said, in the careful language of bureaucratic understatement, activity of uncertain origin and intent has been detected at the North Cairn. All parties are advised to maintain current positions pending assessment. Keth Saros of the Drath Sovereignty received the report and read it twice. Then he called his senior intelligence officer and said, "What is making that sound?" "Unknown, sir. It is not the accord frequency. It is not any signal we have in our records." "Is it the humans?"
A pause.
The patience is currently docked at the cairn, sir. Human life signs are confirmed inside the structure. Keth Saros was quiet.
Play for me, he said.
The intelligence officer played the recording. It was broken and irregular, and sometimes it went wrong in ways that were obvious even to someone who had never heard music that sounded like it. But underneath the irregularity, underneath the searching quality of it, there was something there. Something that was not the accord frequency, but was clearly looking for it. Feeling for it in the dark. Keth Saros, who had been a general for 30 years and before that a soldier for 20, and who had grown up in a civilization that valued efficiency and strategic clarity above almost all else, sat in his command center and listened to a human woman feeling for a song in the dark 6,000 light years away. And he found, to his profound surprise, that he did not want her to stop. Sorvith received Mara's request at what the Velsheri would have called the third resonance of the evening, a time of day that carried cultural connotations of deep conversation, of things said that couldn't be unsaid, of honesty that had waited long enough. The request was simple. 3 words. Come play with me. Sorvith had served as a diplomat for 60 years. She had negotiated 17 major accord amendments. She had talked 3 civilizations back from the edge of war using nothing but patience, language, and an extraordinarily precise understanding of what different species needed to hear. She had once spent 9 months in a room with representatives of 2 civilizations who refused to be in the same room and had, through sheer diplomatic will, gotten them to agree to a framework that had held for 40 years since.
She was not easily surprised.
She was very surprised now. You want me to play? She said. Ambassador, I am not. I have not practiced the deep tradition since. How long ago?
A pause.
50 years. But you know it. I knew it. I studied it as a young diplomat because North's history is central to our... She stopped. I haven't played in 50 years. I know, Mara said. I can hear where the soft veil needs the resonance that I can't give it. I can get close with the listener, but there are frequencies in the lower register that I can't reach with my instrument. The cairn will respond. It's already responding in pieces, but it won't produce the full accord frequency unless the deep resonance is right. And the deep resonance needs a Velsheri. A very long silence. Mara, Sorvith said, and the use of her first name was itself a thing of significance. In Velsheri culture, a shift from diplomatic register to something more personal. I want to ask you something. Ask. You could have requested a younger player, a scholar of the deep tradition who has maintained their practice. There are 3 or 4 in my civilization who could. They'd take weeks to get here, Mara said. We have days, maybe. The Drath fleet. That is the practical answer, Sorvith said. I am asking for the other answer. Mara was quiet for a moment. Because you're the ambassador, she said finally. And this isn't just about producing a frequency. North designed this instrument to require 2 players from 2 different civilizations. She built cooperation into the physics of the piece. Which means the playing matters. Who is playing, why they're playing, what it means that they're playing together.
She paused.
If the accord is going to hold, I think it needs to be held by someone who knows what it costs, not just someone who knows the notes. A silence that stretched for so long that Mara thought the communication might have dropped. Then Sorvith said, very quietly, in what the translation filter rendered as something close to wonder. North wrote something like that. In the oldest documents. I read it when I was young, and I thought it was poetic language. I did not think she was describing the actual mechanics of the... She was describing the actual mechanics, Mara said. She built it that way on purpose. Another long silence. I will come, Sorvith said. She boarded a fast courier vessel within the hour. The journey to the cairn took 11 hours. During those 11 hours, she sat in the ship's small cabin and did something she had not done in 50 years. She practiced. Her playing was rough. Her frequency control was uneven, the deep resonance that was the core of Velsheri musical tradition flickering in and out of focus like a flame in wind. She had let the skill go untended for so long that the pathways felt unfamiliar, overgrown. But underneath the rust, the music was still there. She played through the night. Sorvith floated in the central chamber of the North Cairn and looked at the Sothvale for a long time without speaking. Mara waited. She had learned in the 11 years since humans had joined the Accord that different species needed different amounts of time with important things. Humans tended to move fast. Velsheri tended to stop. She was very careful, Sorvith said at last. Her voice was low. The construction. Every element is precise. I know, Mara said. I did not know she was also a builder of this caliber. Our histories record her primarily as a diplomat, as a negotiator. A pause. We called her the long patience. Another pause. I wonder now if she was patient not because she had learned to wait, but because she had already built the thing she was waiting for. She built the peace before anyone agreed to it, Mara said. And then she spent the rest of her life talking people into agreeing. Yes, Sorvith said softly.
Yes.
That is exactly it. They positioned themselves at the Sothvale, Sorvith at the main playing surface, her long fingers settling into positions that her body remembered even when her mind thought it had forgotten. Mara at the second interface, with the listener floating beside her. We will sound wrong at first, Sorvith said. I know. We'll find it. We may not be able to. Sorvith. Mara met the ambassador's many-faceted eyes, or the nearest equivalent, the sensory organs that caught light and resonance simultaneously. We're not trying to be perfect. We're trying to be true. Those aren't the same thing. A pause. Velren would have said something like that, Sorvith said quietly.
Tell me about her, Mara said.
While we play, tell me about the last keeper. Something in Sorvitha's bearing shifted. Not quite grief. Not quite readiness. Something in between. All right, she said. And they began. The first minutes were difficult. Sorvitha's deep resonance frequencies were unsteady. 50 years of absence had left the skill fragile, and the emotion of being here, in this place, doing this thing, was not making steadiness easier to find. Mara's listener reached for the harmonics and found some but not others, and the cairn received their playing with the polite uncertainty of a space that had been asked a question it needed to think about. Sorvith talked about Velren as she played, about how she had been appointed keeper young, only 40 years old, which was unusually young for a Velsheri to hold a deep tradition position, about how she had treated the role as a form of devotion rather than a duty, about her partner, Velhas of the Bright Interval, who had played the paired voice in their private music and who had died in a transport accident on the outer routes 2 months ago, and how Velren had come to the cairn 3 more times after that and played with the silence beside her where the harmony should have been, and how the playing must have gotten harder each time, and how the last time she had come, she had played for 4 hours alone and then simply stopped and not come back. Mara listened and played, and adjusted the listener's resonance each time she heard the cairn reaching for something she wasn't giving it. At the 40-minute mark, something changed. She felt it before she heard it, a shift in the vibration of the crystalline walls around them. A deepening, as if the chamber was settling into itself, becoming more present, more alive. Sorvith felt it too. Her playing steadied. They looked at each other and didn't stop. The listener found a harmonic interval it had been searching for and locked in with a sound that made the instrument vibrate through Mara's whole body, up through her arms, into her chest. The Sothvale answered with a low, deep chord that resonated through the spherical chamber and went out through the channels and hollow struts of the cairn's body, like a breath. A subsonic pulse moved out from the structure. Not the full accord frequency. Not yet. But something that had the shape of it. The intention of it. On the Kwarathi monitoring station, Vressi's instruments registered the pulse, and she made a sound that her colleagues would later describe as being somewhere between a gasp and a note of music. On the Drath command ship, Kethsaros' intelligence officer came running. On every inhabited world in the Kethra cluster, resonance-sensitive instruments registered a faint pulse, not the 7-second heartbeat of the Accord, not yet, but a tremor, a footstep, a beginning. The two of them played for another hour, getting closer, finding the frequency in pieces, losing it, finding it again. Sorvitha's deep tradition studying as the muscle memory reasserted itself. Mara's listener adapting in real time, The filament she had spent 7 years building vibrating in a crystalline alien chamber in a way she had never imagined when she built it, and that somehow felt, anyway, exactly right. And then, at the 90-minute mark, they found it together. The accord frequency. Not exactly as it had sounded for 6,000 years. It was different. Marked by the two voices that were making it, by a human instrument's upper register and a Velsheri diplomat's deep resonance, and 50 years of rust and 23 years of archaeology and grief for a keeper they'd never met, and something that wasn't quite hope, but was pointed in that direction. It pulsed outward.
Once.
7 seconds later, it pulsed again. The reemergence of the accord frequency was not subtle. The Velsheri experienced it the way they experienced most things, as resonance. The pulse moved through their bodies, through the structures they inhabited, through the frequency-sensitive membranes that served as their primary perceptual organs, and it said to them, with 6,000 years of cultural weight behind it, the accord still holds. But it said it differently than it had before. There was something in the upper register that hadn't been there before, a new voice, harmonically coherent with a deep resonance but distinct from it, carrying something that Velsheri frequency scholars would spend the next several years trying to name. They eventually settled on the welcome note, a frequency that said not just the accord holds but the accord is held by more than one. The Korathi experienced it as data. Primarily, their monitoring systems lit up across the board, clean and clear and unmistakably the accord frequency, and their analysts immediately began the process of verifying, cross-referencing, and reporting. But Vresi, who had been awake for 31 hours and was running on something that was not quite professional calm anymore, heard it through the station's hull and sat down on the floor of the monitoring room and put her secondary hands over her face and made no sound at all for a long time, which her colleagues accepted as the reasonable response it was. The three smaller civilizations in the cluster's midarm, the ones who had been under Drath military pressure, who had been most exposed by the silencing of the cairn, received the pulse with a response that their diplomats would later describe, with varying degrees of embarrassment about their own emotionality, as relief so large it was almost disorienting. Two of their governments called emergency sessions of their legislatures, not to respond to a crisis, but because their heads of state needed a formal venue in which to say, publicly and officially, that the crisis had passed, that they were still here, that the accord held. The Drath sovereignty experienced it with something considerably more complicated. Keth Saros heard the pulse on the bridge of his command ship and stood very still for a full minute. His officers watched him. Nobody spoke. Then he turned to his communications officer and said, "Get me a line to the Velsheri ambassador." The communications officer looked uncertain. "Sir, Ambassador Sorvith is currently at the—" "I know where she is," Keth Saros said. "Get me the line anyway." It took 40 minutes to establish. When Sorvith's voice came through, slightly rough, still carrying the resonant quality of someone who had been playing for hours, Keth Saros said, without preamble, "Who is playing the upper voice?" A pause. "A human," Sorvith said. "Dr. Mara Ose. She is an archaeologist." "An archaeologist," Keth Saros repeated. "Yes. Not a diplomat. Not a military advisor. Not a political operative." "No." A pause. "She found the instrument," Sorvith said. "She recognized what it was. She spent 4 hours playing to it alone before I arrived, trying to understand what it needed." A pause. "She asked me to come. She said the accord needed to be held by someone who knew what it cost." A pause. "She was right." Keth Saros was quiet for a long time. "I would like to meet her," he said finally. When the situation has stabilized." "I will pass that along," Sorvith said. "Tell her," he stopped. Started again. "Tell her that the Drath sovereignty would like to open a dialogue. About the accord. About what it means. We have been members in name, but not in. I have spent 30 years preparing for a war that I have been told is inevitable. I would like to understand why I was told that, and whether it was true." A pause. "The sound of the cairn was we always said it was a political signal. A reminder of the power arrangement. Not a—" He stopped again. "I did not expect it to sound like that." "Like what?" Sorvith said. A very long pause from Keth Saros. "Like something made by people who were trying," he said. There is a practice among Velsheri diplomats when they conclude something that matters, a treaty, a negotiation, a long and difficult conversation that has changed something in the world, of sitting in silence for a full 7 count. 7 seconds of quiet that mirrors the pulse of the cairn. Not to mark an ending, but to mark a before and after. This is what we were before this moment, the silence says.
This is what we are now.
Mara and Sorvith sat in the central chamber of the North cairn after the accord frequency had been restored, and Mara, who had not known about this tradition, sat in silence anyway, because she had been trained by 23 years of archaeology to understand that some silences are not empty. After a while, Sorvith said, "You cried." "My helmet fogged up," Mara said. "Yes," Sorvith said, with the tone of someone who is not going to argue about this. The listener floated between them, the last notes of their playing still faintly vibrating in its filaments, not audibly, but in the way that instruments hold onto the memory of sound for a little while after the playing stops. Mara reached out and steadied it with one hand, and it hummed against her palm. "She designed this well," Mara said. "She designed it for us," Sorvith said. "Even though she did not know us. She designed it for whatever civilization would eventually arrive at the edge of the cluster and not know enough to be afraid of things they didn't understand." A pause. "I think she hoped. I think she built the hope into the physics." "She built the need into the physics," Mara said. "The hope was up to us." A silence. "What happens now?" Mara asked. "The cluster stabilizes," Sorvith said. "The border skirmishes stand down. The Drath fleet withdraws." A pause. "And then the harder work begins. Because the cairn's silence revealed something that we cannot pretend we didn't see, that we had lost the understanding of what we were maintaining. That 6,000 years of retranslation had turned a living practice into an empty ritual. That we have been holding the accord without knowing why the accord needs to be held the way North designed it."
She paused.
"That will require many conversations." "And the cairn," Mara said. "You can't rely on a single keeper anymore. Not after this." "No," Sorvith said. "We will need a different approach. A school, perhaps. A practice of teaching the deep tradition to players from multiple civilizations, so that what happened with Velren cannot happen again." She paused. "Would you?" "Yes," Mara said. Sorvith paused. "I had not finished asking." "You were going to ask if I would help design the teaching program," Mara said. "The acoustic archaeology side. How to teach someone to listen to a space before they play in it." She paused.
"Yes.
I'll help." "I was also going to ask if you would consider being the first of the human instructors," Sorvith said. Mara was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a diplomat," she said. "No," Sorvith said. "You are better suited for this than a diplomat. A diplomat knows how to negotiate between positions. You know how to listen to something until it tells you what it needs." A pause. "That is a different skill. And a rarer one." Mara thought about Velren of the Diminishing Line, who had played alone in this chamber for 6 months with the silence beside her where the harmony should have been, and had played as long as she could, and then had stopped because she was human in all the ways that matter, even if she wasn't human at all, because she had reached the end of what she could do alone, and had not known how to ask for the second voice. She thought about Norith, who had known, who had built the asking into the instrument. She thought about Caro, not a word, exactly in this context, but a sound. A turning. The moment when something that was going wrong begins to turn toward something else. Of SYMJHY, she thought. The phrase floated up from somewhere inside her, not her native language, not a word she used every day, but a phrase she carried with her the way some people carry songs, meaning something like, "From this moment I choose. From this moment, let me be someone who builds rather than only finds." "Okay," she said. "Yes." "Good," Sorvith said. And then, after a pause, in a tone that was the Velsheri equivalent of a smile, "I will warn you that teaching is considerably harder than playing." "Everything worth doing is harder than it looks," Mara said. The listener hummed in her hands. Around them, the North cairn breathed. The crystalline walls held the warmth of the sound they had made in them. Through the hollow struts and channels and chambers of the structure, built by a woman 6,000 years dead, who had loved music and peace and had believed, apparently, that you could build one in the shape of the other. The accord frequency moved outward at the speed of light. 7 seconds.
Pulse.
7 seconds.
Pulse.
Every 7 seconds, a reminder. We are still here. The accord still holds. Not because it was always easy. Not because no one ever tested it or lost faith in it or forgot what it was for. But because someone, somewhere was still playing. And they were not playing alone. Yendi.